Part 3, Chapter 11 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Scotch Reformation. The Scotch Reformers were of sturdy type, like their own rugged hills. Their country was not as yet under the English crown, but was a separate kingdom, divided into fierce and warlike clans, and ruled by the Stuarts, a royal family in full sympathy with Rome. The bishops and the rulers were in close league to resist all Protestant encroachments. The new doctrines, however, did cross the Tweed, and were adopted there in various parts of the country. Cardinal Beaton was appointed leading inquisitor, and he did not hesitate to kill heretics, and even burn at the stake George Wishart, one of the most celebrated preachers and devout Christians of the time. Patrick Hamilton was the first Protestant leader. He was for a time on the Continent, and, though the movement was hazardous, he returned to Scotland to carry out the cause that lay near his heart. He was not long permitted to preach and teach the new doctrines. He suffered martyrdom, and his followers were left without a guide. Mary Stuart was the daughter of James V., King of Scotland. Her father said of her, "The kingdom came wi' a lass," daughter of Robert Bruce, "and it will gae wi' a lass." His words became a correct prophecy. The country was under a protectorate during her minority, about 19 years. Through this period the drift was constantly towards Protestantism. The Scotch had imbibed the Calvinistic doctrines, and were growing firmer in their attachment every year. Mary, on her reception as queen, caused great offense to them. Her French confessors and courtiers gave extreme Roman Catholic color to the very first days of her reign. Knox expressed the deep feeling of the people when he prayed, "Purify, O Lord, the heart of the queen from the poison of idolatry. Release her from the bondage of Satan in which she was brought up, and in which, from want of true teaching, she still remains." Mary's life was not blameless. In 1565 she was married to the Earl of Darnley. A disagreement took place between them, and, the queen being attached to an Italian, Rizzio, Darnley headed a conspiracy which murdered him. Darnley himself, according to the general opinion of the Scotch at the time, was put to death by Bothwell, at Mary's insistence, through the combined method of strangling and the explosion of the house in which he lay ill. Shortly afterwards Mary married Bothwell. The people had endured her rule as long as possible. The illustration of Romanism in the rule and life of their queen was enough to make the whole land thoroughly Protestant. The Revolution broke out with great violence, and Mary fled to England. She had been invited by Elizabeth, and, when the invitation was accepted, Elizabeth showed her hospitality by throwing her into prison. Mary hoped that, Elizabeth having once been declared illegitimate, she might lead the Roman Catholics of the country to revolt against Elizabeth's rule, and herself become Queen of England. But Elizabeth was too shrewd to allow such a plan to succeed. Mary was tried and put to death in 1587, and Elizabeth became practically Queen of both England and Scotland. Mary's revenge came, however, after her death, when her son succeeded Elizabeth as James VI. of Scotland and James I. of England. John Knox was Hamilton's natural successor. He began just where his predecessor had left off, and very soon the Scotch Protestants felt the power of his genius. He was born in 1505, and in 1542 publicly proclaimed himself in Edinburgh as a reformer. His studies had been leading him thither for some time, but from the moment of his public renunciation of Romanism he never wavered. His heroism was as intense as that of Luther. He felt, and therefore he spoke. He was degraded from his office as preacher in St. Andrews, and sent to France, where he was subjected nearly 2 years to hard labor in the galleys. As soon as he was released, he promptly returned to Scotland, and preached the doctrines of the Reformation with great eloquence. When Mary Queen of Scots ascended the throne, he fled to Germany, where he established himself in Frankfort on the Main, as one of the 300 Protestant exiles. He became pastor of the little colony of English refugees. From there he went to Geneva, where he imbibed from Calvin himself the Calvinistic type of Protestantism. He was burned in effigy in Scotland by Mary's order, a very harmless proceeding on her part. In 1558 he published his First Blast of the Trumpet against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. The Protestants formed an organized body, and bound themselves to resistance by a covenant. The country became involved in civil war, and when peace was restored, Queen Mary had 6 interviews with him, and, though moved to tears by his eloquence, afterwards caused his arrest on the charge of treason. But the court acquitted him. He was fearless in all his work. His life was in constant danger, but he at no time hesitated to preach and teach the Protestant doctrines. He died in Edinburgh in 1572. By the time of his death the triumph of the Scotch Reformation was complete. It was the victory of the people, under the leadership of a brave and true man, against the combined forces of a queen, a court, and a powerful nobility. The Scotch Reformers did their work so thoroughly that it was never necessary to do it over again. They had written their protest with their own blood, and it stands to this day. End of chapter 11.